The Wyoming sun was a relentless, punishing orb that hammered down upon the dusty thoroughfare of Fort Bridger in July of 1872. For Beatrice Parker, the heat was not merely a physical burden, it was a weight that seemed to fuse the iron collar around her neck directly into her skin. The metal, forged in a moment of cruel possessiveness by a man now rotting in the earth, gleamed with a dull, sickening light. It was a brand, a heavy circle of cold entrapment that marked her not as a woman of 21 years, but as a beast of burden to be traded, used, and discarded. As she stood in the center of the town's main street, the grit of the frontier wind stinging her eyes, she wondered if she was destined to die with that metal throat clasp still choking the life from her spirit. Her wrists were bound with a coarse, hempen rope that had long since worn her flesh into a map of raw, weeping sores. Every movement was a reminder of her status, liquidated assets from the estate of Thaddeus Crane. Crane, a railroad magnate who had viewed the world through the lens of ownership, had purchased her from a San Francisco gambling den to settle a debt. When she had tried to flee his suffocating protection 6 months prior, he had rewarded her defiance with the collar, a permanent declaration that she was property, devoid of legal standing or human agency. Now, with Crane dead of a sudden heart seizure, his lawyers were stripping his life of its parts, and Beatrice was simply another item on the ledger. She stood amidst the swirling dust, her dark auburn hair matted and tangled, hanging in limp curtains over her shoulders. The thin cotton dress she wore was a ghost of a garment, stained by the miles and torn at the hem, offering little shield against the leering eyes of the crowd. Despite the visible fragility of her frame, a startling hardness dwelled in her blue eyes, a look of ancient exhaustion that far exceeded her chronological age. She was a daughter of Sacramento, born to a mother who had walked the streets until the world finally broke her when Beatrice was only 14. Left alone in a society that viewed young, unanchored women as a resource to be exploited, she had been claimed by a crooked saloon owner under the guise of her mother's debts. Since then, her existence had been a relentless series of transactions, each one more degrading and soul-eroding than the last. The auctioneer, a man whose pot-belly strained against a greasy vest and whose teeth were stained a permanent yellow by tobacco, began his rhythmic, hollow chant. He spoke of her as one might describe a mare at a county fair, highlighting her strong back and her breeding potential with a casual vulgarity that made the bile rise in her throat. He called for an opening bid of $50, his voice a gravelly drone that competed with the distant hammers of a blacksmith and the lowing of parched cattle. Beatrice kept her gaze fixed firmly on the parched earth at her feet, refusing to grant the gathered men the satisfaction of seeing her fear or her fury. Experience had taught her that defiance in such moments was a spark that only invited the lash. Silence was the only armor she had left. Yet, beneath the surface of her outward submission, a furnace of silent rage burned with white-hot intensity. She whispered a vow to the dust. She would rather seek the finality of the grave than belong to another master who believed that gold coins conferred the right to own her soul. $50! Shouted a merchant from the edge of the circle, his eyes darting over her with a predatory, calculating greed. 60, countered a rancher whose hands were gnarled and thick, looking like instruments that had spent a lifetime crushing the life out of softer things. Beatrice felt a wave of nausea roll through her. She surreptitiously tested the strength of the ropes at her wrists, calculating the distance to the nearest alleyway, but the logic of the frontier was against her. A woman in a collar, bound and marked, would not survive 10 feet before being tackled back into the dirt. The laws of the territory were written by men like those bidding on her, designed to protect the rights of owners and the sanctity of the contract, never the safety of the commodity. Suddenly, a voice sliced through the humid air, cutting the auctioneer's patter short like a blade through silk. $100. The tone was deep, steady, and lacked the frantic, hungry edge of the previous bidders. The crowd shifted, parting like a slow-moving tide to reveal the man who had spoken. He appeared to be in his late 20s, possessing the sun-weathered complexion of someone who lived by the cycles of the sky. His dark brown hair was shaggy, escaping from beneath a hat that had clearly seen years of hard use against the elements. He wore the practical, unpretentious attire of a working cowboy, denim pants coated in a fine layer of trail dust, a chambray shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with functional muscle, and worn leather boots. But it was his eyes that arrested Beatrice's attention. They were a clear, piercing hazel. More importantly, they were looking directly at her face, not at the swell of her chest, not at the glint of the iron collar, but at her eyes, as if searching for the person buried beneath the wreckage. The auctioneer's face lit up with an oily, triumphant grin, sensing a windfall. 100 from Ethan Barrett. Do I hear 110? The merchant scowled and stepped back into the shadows, and the rancher spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt before turning away. In 1872, $100 was a staggering sum, representing months of grueling labor for a common ranch hand. The gavel, a heavy wooden mallet, came down with a final, echoing thud. Sold to Ethan Barrett for $100. At the sound, Beatatrice felt a small, vital part of her inner resolve splinter. It mattered little that this stranger had eyes that didn't hold the usual cruelty. She had learned through bitter experience that kind men could be the most dangerous monsters of all, once the doors were closed and the public mask was removed. She watched with a hollow heart as Ethan stepped forward, his movements economical and calm. He counted out the payment in gold coins, which the auctioneer snatched with a predatory speed that made his fingers look like talons. Then the man who now held her contract turned toward her. He reached for a knife sheathed at his belt, and Beatrice flinched, her muscles tensing for the blow she assumed was coming. Instead, he moved with a surprising, focused gentleness. He reached for her wrists and, with a swift flick of the blade, severed the coarse ropes that had kept her bound. The sudden release of pressure was jarring. "You're going to bleed if we don't get those cleaned up," he said, his voice low and devoid of the expected command. He looked at the raw, chafed skin of her wrists with a frown of genuine concern, waiting for her to find her footing in a world that had suddenly, inexplicably changed shape. Beatrice stood frozen as the ropes fell away, her mind struggling to process the absence of pain. Ethan Barrett did not grab her or haul her toward a waiting wagon. He simply stood there, granting her the space to acknowledge her own legs. When he asked if she could walk, she managed a silent, fragile nod, her vocal cords feeling as though they had been rusted shut by months of enforced silence under Thaddeus Crane's rule. As they began to thread their way through the narrow, dusty streets of Fort Bridger, Beatrice felt the weight of the town's collective gaze. The iron collar was a beacon of her shame, a cold ring that seemed to vibrate with every step she took. She saw the flickers of pity from women in bonnets who pulled their children away, and the lingering speculative stares of men who wondered what Barrett intended to do with such an expensive purchase. To the world, she was still a thing, a piece of mobile property following its new master into the unknown. Ethan, however, walked a pace ahead, never looking back to ensure she followed, as if he expected her to move of her own volition. They reached the livery stable, where the scent of dry hay and horse sweat offered a brief, earthy reprieve from the oppressive heat of the open street. He had 2 horses ready, a powerful chestnut gelding and a smaller, sturdy bay mare. He didn't order her onto the horse. He gestured toward the bay and asked if she could ride. Her yes was a raspy ghost of a sound, the first word of her own she had spoken in years. The ride northeast out of Fort Bridger was a slow, rhythmic immersion into the vastness of the Wyoming territory. As the town faded into a collection of weathered shacks against the horizon, the landscape opened up in a beautiful, terrifying expanse of sagebrush and rolling hills. Beatrice rode the bay mare, her fingers gripping the reins with a white-knuckled intensity that made her knuckles ache. She was hyper-aware of Ethan's presence just a few yards ahead, his broad shoulders swaying with the motion of his horse. She spent the miles memorizing the silhouettes of the distant mountains, the winters rising like jagged teeth to the south, trying to plot a map of escape she was certain she would eventually need. The sky was an impossible, endless blue, so wide it made her feel like a speck of dust, yet for the first time in 2 years, the air she breathed didn't feel quite so heavy. Still, her mind was a whirlwind of dark speculation. She had known men who used kindness as a lure, a way to soften a woman's spirit before shattering it completely. Was he taking her to some isolated cabin to perform acts that even the auction block would shudder at? The silence between them was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a held breath. Every time Ethan slowed his horse or adjusted his hat, she flinched, expecting the sudden transition from the gentleman to the owner. The iron around her neck remained a constant, chafing reminder that no matter how far they rode, she was still a prisoner of the metal. As the sun began its long, golden descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in violent streaks of violet and burnt orange, Ethan finally broke the silence. He didn't look back at her, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead, but his voice carried clearly through the cooling air. He spoke of the collar, asking if Crane had been the one to forge it onto her. When she whispered her affirmation, he asked if there was a key or a lock she might have hidden. The no that left her lips felt like a final confession of her own permanence as an object. She watched his jaw tighten, a muscle jumping in his weathered cheek, a flash of controlled, righteous anger that wasn't directed at her, but at the very existence of the iron itself. He told her then, with a blunt, quiet certainty, that once they reached his land, he would remove it. He warned her about the metal cutters, telling her he didn't want her to be frightened when he approached her with the heavy tools. Beatrice felt a strange, terrifying flutter of hope in her chest, but she quickly strangled it. Hope was a dangerous indulgence for a woman in her position, a luxury that usually preceded a fall. They soon crested a final ridge, and the Barrett ranch came into view. It wasn't the opulent, marble-pillared estate of a man like Crane. It was a modest, honest spread of log and stone. There was a sturdy cabin, a well-kept barn, and a corral where a few horses watched their arrival with flicking ears. It was a place built by a man's own sweat, standing as a lonely outpost of order in the wild, rolling sea of the prairie. After they dismounted, Ethan took the horses into the shadows of the barn, leaving her standing alone in the center of the yard. He told her to go inside the cabin and eat whatever she could find, his voice devoid of the sharp edge of command she was accustomed to. Entering the cabin felt like stepping into another man's soul. It was a single large room, impeccably clean but sparse. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and a solitary bed sat in the far corner. Seeing that bed, Beatrice felt the familiar cold knot of dread tighten in her stomach. This was the script she knew: the meal, the bed, the demand. She found bread, cheese, and a jar of preserved peaches on the shelves. Despite her fear, the hunger she had suppressed for days roared to life. She ate with shaking hands, the sweetness of the peaches almost overwhelming her senses, a sharp contrast to the bitterness of her life. She was still standing by the small kitchen table when Ethan entered, carrying a pair of heavy-duty metal cutters and a small leather pouch. The air in the cabin seemed to thin as he approached. He held up his hands, palms outward, a silent plea for her to trust the process. He spoke of the collar as an abomination, saying that no human should ever be forced to wear the mark of a beast. He offered her a choice she didn't believe was real: stay as a paid worker or leave with a horse and money once the iron was gone. To Beatrice, it sounded like a beautiful, impossible lie designed to make her lower her guard for the inevitable moment he would claim his property. With a trembling chin held high, Beatrice finally allowed him to step into her personal space. The scent of him, dust, horsehair, and old leather, filled her lungs as he positioned the heavy cutters against the iron ring. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the pinch of pain or the sudden shift in his demeanor. The sound of the shears biting through the metal was a sharp, mechanical crack that echoed through the quiet room. Suddenly, the weight that had defined her existence for 6 months simply vanished. The two halves of the collar clattered onto the wooden table with a hollow metallic ring that seemed to signal the end of an era. Beatrice gasped, her hands flying to her throat to touch the bare, indented skin. The absence of the iron felt more foreign than the presence of it ever had. Ethan didn't linger. He picked up the discarded pieces with a look of profound disgust and walked out into the gathering twilight. Following him to the door, she watched as he took a shovel from the side of the house and began to dig a deep, narrow hole at the edge of the property. He didn't just throw the metal away, he buried it with a grim, funereal solemnity, packing the earth down with his boots as if interring a demon. When he returned, his hands were stained with the Wyoming soil. He looked at her not as a master looking at a purchase, but as a man who had just finished a necessary ugly chore. "That's done," he said, the finality of it ringing truer than anything she had ever heard. "You'll never wear iron again." The evening air turned sharp and cold as Ethan sat across from her at the small table, his large frame casting a long shadow against the log walls. He laid out the terms of her new reality with a directness that lacked any hint of flirtation or hidden agenda. He admitted his own shame in participating in the auction system, even if his intent had been to save her from worse men. Then he did the unthinkable. He pulled a loaded revolver from his pocket and placed it on the table between them. He told her it was hers for protection, and that if he ever crossed the boundaries of her safety, she was to use it on him. He claimed he would rather be dead than become a man who forced himself upon a woman. To Beatrice, this felt like the most elaborate trap of all, a test of her loyalty or a game to see if she would dare to reach for power. He took a blanket, told her to bolt the door behind him, and headed for the barn. That night, Beatrice did not sleep in the bed. She sat in the wooden chair, the heavy revolver resting in her lap, her eyes fixed on the bolted door as the crickets sang their rhythmic, lonely songs outside. She waited for the sound of his footsteps, for the handle to turn, for the mask to slip and reveal the monster. But the night remained undisturbed, save for the distant, haunting cry of a coyote. As the first grey light of dawn filtered through the window, she looked at the gun and then at her own bare neck in the mirror, wondering if the freedom she felt was real or merely a longer tether. The arrival of dawn brought with it the sounds of a world in motion, the rhythmic lowing of cattle and the sharp metallic clatter of buckets, proving that the night had passed without the violence Beatrice had anticipated. She stood before the small silvered mirror in the cabin, her fingers tracing the faint purple-tinged indentation where the iron had lived for half a year. When a soft knock sounded at the door, she reached instinctively for the revolver, but Ethan's voice was merely a quiet announcement of water left on the porch for her morning wash. After ensuring he had retreated to the corral, she brought the bucket inside, the water cool and shimmering with the morning light. The soap he provided smelled sharply of lye and faintly of lavender, a harsh, cleansing scent that felt like the first step in scrubbing away the layers of degradation that had settled into her very pores. She washed with a frantic, focused intensity, wishing the water could reach the memories as easily as it did the trail dust. Having no other garments, she donned the stained cotton dress once more, but the weight of the revolver in her pocket served as a new kind of corset, one that offered strength instead of restriction. She found him in the corral, working a young horse with a patience that bordered on the spiritual. He didn't demand the animal's submission, he invited its trust. In that moment, Beatatrice stepped forward and offered her own terms. She would stay, she would work, and she would be paid a real wage, but the cabin was her sanctuary, and the gun was her final word on her own safety. Ethan didn't hesitate. He reached out a calloused hand and offered a handshake, a gesture of partnership that treated her, for the first time in her adult life, as a sovereign human being. The weeks that followed were defined by the brutal, honest geometry of ranch labor. Beatrice discovered that while her body was weary, her mind found a strange sort of peace in the repetitive demands of the land. She learned the temperamental nature of the wood-burning stove, the art of baking bread in a heavy Dutch oven, and the meticulous care required to coax vegetables from the stubborn Wyoming soil. Ethan was a man of few words but infinite instruction, teaching her to ride with a confidence she had never known and showing her how to track a deer through the silver-green sagebrush without breaking a single twig. He never crossed the threshold of the cabin without an explicit invitation, and he continued to sleep in the barn even as the nights grew increasingly crisp with the approach of autumn. There were moments, fleeting and sharp, when their hands would brush as they passed a heavy iron pot or a bundle of firewood. In those seconds, Beatrice would feel the old familiar panic flare in her chest, but it was always met by Ethan's immediate quiet apology and a respectful retreat. He was a man who lived by a code of restraint that she struggled to categorize. She watched him work himself to the point of exhaustion, his broad frame silhouetted against the setting sun as he repaired endless miles of fencing. She began to wonder about the internal engine that drove him. What kind of ghost or god demanded such a rigorous adherence to the idea of a woman's autonomy? The answer finally emerged on a late August evening as they sat on the porch watching the stars pierce through the darkening velvet of the sky. The air was thick with the scent of dry grass and wood smoke when Beatrice finally asked the question that had been simmering in her mind. Why had he spent a fortune on a woman he intended to set free? Ethan remained silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the distant mountain peaks. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with the weight of a decade-old grief. He told her about Emily, a sister who had been his North Star after their parents were claimed by cholera. He spoke of their poverty and the desperation that had led Emily to take work in a Sacramento saloon, the same city where Beatrice's own tragedy had begun. He described the moment he realized his sister had been trapped by a debt contract and sold to a man heading for the coast. Ethan had fought for her, taking a beating that had left him unconscious for days, and by the time he had risen from the blood-soaked floor, Emily was a ghost, vanished into the lawless fog of San Francisco. He had spent 5 years scouring the docks and the brothels, searching for a girl who likely didn't want to be found, or who had already succumbed to the darkness of that world. "I couldn't save her," he whispered, his jaw tight with a pain that time had failed to dull. "So when I saw you in that street, wearing that iron, I didn't see a stranger. I saw the chance to do for one woman what I failed to do for my own blood." The revelation of Ethan's failure acted as a key, unlocking a door within Beatrice that she had kept bolted since her 14th year. For the first time, she found herself speaking the names of her own tormentors, her voice steady in the darkness. She told him about her mother's lonely death in a room that smelled of cheap gin and despair, and about the saloon owner who had inherited her like a piece of furniture. She detailed the years of being passed from hand to hand, the merchant who had viewed her as a status symbol, the gambler who had treated her like a lucky charm to be kept under lock and key, and finally, Thaddeus Crane. She spoke of Crane's civilization, a thin veneer of manners that masked a profound, systematic cruelty. He hadn't just wanted her body, he had wanted the total annihilation of her will, using the iron collar as a physical manifestation of his psychological dominance. As she spoke, the trauma seemed to lose some of its jagged edges, transformed from a secret shame into a shared history. Ethan didn't offer the easy, hollow pity that many men used to make themselves feel superior. Instead, he looked at her with a profound, quiet respect. He told her that her survival wasn't a mark of being used, but a testament to a strength that most people would never possess. He spoke of the future not as a destination he would lead her toward, but as a landscape she was now free to map for herself. By the time the conversation ended, the fire in the hearth had dwindled to glowing embers, and a new, fragile understanding had taken root between them. Beatrice realized that Ethan Barrett wasn't a hero from a dime novel come to rescue a damsel. He was a man seeking atonement for a world that broke the things he loved. They were two damaged souls, each carrying a different set of scars, trying to build a sanctuary on the edge of a wilderness that cared for neither of them. That night, for the first time since she had arrived at the ranch, Beatrice didn't sit watch in the chair. She laid down in the bed, the revolver still beneath her pillow, but her hand no longer gripping the handle. She allowed herself to drift into a sleep that wasn't haunted by the sound of clicking locks or the weight of metal. She dreamt of the wide Wyoming sky and the feeling of the wind on a neck that was finally gloriously bare. In the silence of the cabin, the shadows of the past seemed to retreat, pushed back by the steady, unassuming presence of the man sleeping in the barn. A man who had given her a gun and a choice, and in doing so, had given her the first real breath of her life. The men arrived in a swirl of dust and the creak of tired leather. They were drifters of the worst sort, men whose faces were maps of violence and whose eyes held the vacant, dangerous stare of those who lived entirely outside the reach of the law. The leader was a man with a jagged scar that bisected his left cheek, pulling his mouth into a permanent, mocking sneer. He sat atop a soot-colored horse looking around the modest Barrett ranch with the assessing, greedy gaze of a wolf counting sheep. He addressed Ethan with a familiar, oily arrogance, claiming to represent the interests of Jackson Crane, the nephew of the late Thaddeus. The message was as cold as the October wind. The property known as Beatatrice Parker had been improperly liquidated from the estate, and Jackson Crane wanted his inheritance returned. They offered a pittance of a refund, $120, as if the 6 months of Beatrice's life and the scars on her neck could be settled with a $20 profit for Ethan's trouble. To these men, the idea of a woman having a choice was an absurdity, a glitch in the divine order of commerce. Beatrice, watching through the glass, felt a surge of white-hot adrenaline. The iron collar was buried in the dirt, but these men were trying to forge a new one out of words and threats. She watched Ethan stand his ground, his silhouette unmoving against the darkening sky, a solitary man against three, his voice ringing out with a finality that made the air feel electric. "The woman is not for sale," he stated, and in that simple sentence he discarded the last vestiges of the transaction that had brought her there. The transition from negotiation to violence happened with the suddenness of a lightning strike. The scarred man's hand blurred toward his holster, his intent written in the predatory flare of his nostrils. But Ethan Barrett had lived through a war and a decade of frontier survival. He was already moving before the other man's thumb had cleared the hammer. A single shot rang out, a sharp, rolling crack that echoed off the cabin walls, and the leader spun in his saddle, his shoulder erupting in a bloom of crimson. The other two men, startled by the ferocity of the response, fumbled for their weapons. Beatatrice didn't hesitate. She kicked open the heavy log door, the sunlight catching the steel of her revolver. She fired twice into the dirt at their horses' feet, the explosions of dust and the scream of the lead making the animals rear in terror. "The next one isn't for the ground," she shouted, her voice a clarion call of defiance that she barely recognized as her own. She stood on the threshold, her hair whipping in the wind, looking every bit the nightmare of any man who thought she could be reclaimed. The two uninjured drifters looked at the bleeding leader, then at the steady, unwavering hands of the woman they had come to collect. They saw the smoke curling from her barrel and the absence of fear in her blue eyes. They realized with the sudden clarity of the dying that this was not a capture. It was a war. They hauled their wounded companion onto his horse and fled into the gathering dusk, their retreat marked by the frantic thud of hooves and the lingering smell of sulfur and cordite. The immediate aftermath was filled with a silence so heavy it felt physical. Beatrice stood on the porch, her chest heaving, the revolver still warm in her hand. Ethan walked toward her, his expression a complex tapestry of relief, shock, and a new, profound kind of recognition. He didn't take the gun from her this time. He simply stood at the bottom of the steps, looking up at the woman who had just saved his life and her own freedom. The smoke of defiance hung between them, a tangible proof that the past no longer held the power to dictate her actions. They spent the next few days in a state of high alert, sleeping in shifts and watching the horizon for any sign of Jackson Crane's return. But the anticipated siege never materialized. Instead, a week later, Ethan made the long ride into Fort Bridger to seek news and legal counsel. When he returned, his horse was lathered, and his face held a look of weary triumph. He brought word that Jackson Crane had been arrested by federal marshals for a sprawling web of embezzlement and fraud. The nephew had been desperately trying to claw back any asset, human or otherwise, to pay off a mountain of debt that had finally collapsed upon him. The claim on Beatrice was revealed to be as fraudulent as the man himself. She was not just free because Ethan said so. She was legally, irrevocably, her own person. The territory, which had once seemed like a vast prison, was now a map of infinite possibilities. That evening, as the first flakes of an early winter snow began to drift down from the leaden sky, they sat together inside the warmth of the cabin. The threat was gone, the property status was erased by a federal seal, and the world was quiet. Beatrice looked at the man who had bought her for $100 and then given her a gun to shoot him if he ever crossed the line. She realized that the legal freedom she had just gained was only a formality. The real freedom had been won on the porch with the smoke in the air and the choice in her heart. She looked at the small cabin and the hard land, and she knew she didn't want the horse and the money he had offered her back in July. She didn't want to run toward the coast or disappear into the anonymity of the East. "I'm staying," she said, and it wasn't a submission to his will but an exercise of her own. She saw the light in Ethan's hazel eyes, a flicker of hope that he had been too afraid to voice. He reached across the table, his hand hovering in the space between them, waiting for her to bridge the final gap. When she placed her hand in his, the calluses of their shared labor meeting in a firm, equal grip, the last of the iron in her soul finally melted away. They were no longer a master and a maid, or a savior and a victim. They were partners, two survivors of the American frontier who had found a way to turn the smoke of defiance into the hearthfire of a home. They were married on a bright, wind-swept day in June of 1873 at the small courthouse in Fort Bridger. The ceremony was a modest affair, attended by a few local ranchers and tradespeople who had come to respect the quiet, hard-working couple from the northeast spread. Beatrice wore a simple blue dress she had painstakingly sewn by lamplight, and Ethan donned a suit that was worn but impeccably clean. As she spoke her vows, her voice was clear and unwavering, a stark contrast to the raspy whisper of the woman who had stood on the auction block only a year prior. Reclaiming her name and her dignity in the eyes of the law was a victory, but the true triumph was the sense of agency she felt as she slid the simple gold band onto her finger. they returned to the ranch as partners in every sense of the word. Beatatrice discovered a keen mind for the logistics of the ranching business, managing the ledgers and navigating the complex negotiations of cattle prices with a shrewdness that impressed even the most seasoned drovers. Ethan, in turn, found that the weight of the frontier was lighter when shared with someone who understood the value of every sunrise. Their love was not a cinematic explosion, but a slow-growing, deep-rooted thing, like the cottonwoods that lined the creek, sturdy, resilient, and capable of weathering any storm. They built their life on a foundation of mutual respect, a sanctuary where the past was acknowledged but never allowed to become a prison. In the spring of 1875, the ranch welcomed a new life, a son they named Samuel, after Ethan's father. Holding her child for the first time, Beatrice felt a tidal wave of emotion that was both joyous and terrifying. She looked at his tiny, perfect hands and his clear hazel eyes, and she made a silent, fierce vow to the heavens. This boy would never know the cold touch of iron or the crushing weight of being owned. 2 years later, a daughter arrived, a bright-eyed girl they named Elizabeth, in honor of the memory of Ethan's lost sister, Emily. Motherhood became Beatrice's ultimate act of reclamation. As she raised her children in a home filled with laughter and books, she was rewriting her own history through theirs. She taught them to read, to ride, and to treat every living soul with a dignity that was not dependent on their station in life. Ethan was a father of quiet strength, his gentleness with the children a constant reminder of the man he had chosen to be. Watching him teach Samuel how to handle a horse or Elizabeth how to identify the constellations, Beatrice realized that they had created something far more valuable than a successful ranch. They had built a legacy of freedom, a lineage that was defined not by the scars of the parents, but by the opportunities of the children. The shadows of Sacramento and the gambling dens of San Francisco felt like a lifetime away, a nightmare from which she had finally fully awakened into the sunlight of a Wyoming morning. By 1880, the Barrett Ranch had prospered beyond their wildest dreams. The small log cabin that had been their first home was now too cramped for a growing family of 5, including their youngest son, Thomas. Ethan made a decision that was as symbolic as it was practical. They would build a grand 2-story house with wide porches and glass windows that would catch the first light of the sun. But before the first stone was laid, Ethan took Beatrice to the edge of the property, to the exact spot where he had buried the iron collar 8 years earlier. "We're going to build the foundation right here," he said, his voice thick with a quiet, enduring devotion. He wanted the heart of their new home, the place where their children would play and they would grow old, to sit directly atop the discarded chains of her past. It was a gesture of profound poetry, a way of ensuring that every step she took within her own house was a literal triumph over the metal that had once sought to break her. The construction took all summer, the sound of hammers and saws a rhythmic anthem of progress. When they finally moved in, the house smelled of fresh cedar and pine, a clean, new scent that signaled the start of a new chapter. Standing in her modern kitchen, looking out over the vast, rolling hills of their land, Beatrice felt a sense of belonging that was so deep it felt spiritual. She was no longer a guest in a man's world. She was the architect of her own destiny, standing on ground that she had earned through sweat, tears, and an uncompromising will to survive. As the 19th century began its long slide into history, the Barrett children grew into the people their parents had dreamt they would become. In 1890, Samuel departed for a university in the East, determined to study law so that he might protect the vulnerable from the same systems that had once failed his mother. Elizabeth followed a few years later, breaking the barriers of her era to study medicine in Colorado, driven by a desire to heal a world that held so much pain. Only Thomas remained on the ranch, his hands as calloused as his father's, his heart tethered to the land and the livestock. The house, once echoing with the chaos of young children, became a place of quiet reflection and the occasional joyful roar of returning grandbabies. Beatrice and Ethan aged together with a grace that only comes from a life well lived. Their hair turned to silver, and the lines on their faces became maps of their shared laughter and hardships. They had survived droughts, blizzards, and economic collapses, but through it all, they had remained each other's North Star. In 1895, Thomas brought home a bride, a strong-willed young woman named Margaret, and the cycle began anew. Beatrice, now a matriarch of the frontier, looked at her granddaughter, Rose, and saw a future that was entirely unburdened by the weight of iron. The girl would grow up in a world that was still harsh, yes, but she would grow up knowing she was a person, not a transaction, a human being with a voice and a choice. In the summer of 1898, Beatrice and Ethan celebrated 25 years of marriage. Their children and grandchildren had gathered from across the territory, the house overflowing with the life they had built together. That night, after the last of the celebratory toasts had been made and the children were tucked into their beds, the two of them sat on the wide porch, watching the stars wheel slowly across the infinite Wyoming sky. The air was cool and smelled of sage and the lingering scent of summer rain. Beatrice leaned her head against Ethan's shoulder, her hand resting in his, the gold band worn smooth by decades of work. "Do you remember the day you bought me?" she asked softly. Ethan smiled, the crinkles around his hazel eyes deepening in the moonlight. "I remember a woman who looked like she could burn down the world with a single glance," he replied. "I remember thinking that $100 was a pittance for such a spirit." Beatrice looked out toward the horizon, toward the spot beneath the floorboards where the iron collar lay in the dark, cold earth. She thought about the journey from that dusty street in Fort Bridger to this porch, a journey measured not in miles, but in the reclamation of her own soul. She was 78 years old, scarred by her history, but defined by her choices. The cowboy had cut the collar and buried it deep, but he had done something far more important. He had stood back and given her the space to become herself. She had been owned, but she had become free. She had been broken, but she had healed. And as the night settled in around them, Beatatrice Parker Barrett closed her eyes, finally and irrevocably at peace.